All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our discussion on the Women's Suffragist and 19th Amendment PowerPoint. So, in order to talk about the women's suffragist movement, we first need to talk about women getting involved in industry and in the workplace. So, around the turn of the century, the late 19th century, many middle and lower class women needed to work outside of the home in order to support their families. And many chose to work in industries. About 25% of those women worked in manufacturing, and many manufacturing workers were also immigrants. Some women chose to work as telephone operators, and some as domestic workers, and primarily domestic workers were consisted of African American former slaves. A tragedy happened in 1911 with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, leaving 146 workers dead. The fire led to a call for reform amongst women, as the majority of those workers were young women, and the reason they died was the buildings were not up to code and there were no laws creating those codes for women workers. So a little background on the movement itself. The movement was officially started in the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. Which was the first gathering of women to discuss women's right to vote. Through that meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony created the National Women's Suffragist Association, or NAWSA, which was primarily consisted of upper-class women fighting for progressive causes. NAWSA also fought for the temperance movement and the abolition of slavery. In 1913, the National Women's Party was created under Alice Paul, and this party was created as a subset of the National Women's Suffragist Association due to their disagreements over the ratification of the 15th Amendment. The National Women's Party consisted of mostly college-educated young women due to the fact that new women's colleges were available at the time. They were more radical. They had a more militant approach. They used a lot of strikes, and they took a lot of their ideas from the British movement, which was a lot more violent and militant in its nature. The National Women's Party picketed the White House under President Wilson in 1917, leading to many women being jailed. And as you could see in the picture on the side of the PowerPoint, they referred to President Wilson as Kaiser Wilson and used more aggressive tactics in the movement. World War I affected the movement in interesting ways. Some women felt that the war helped the movement and that it showed women stepping up to take over roles that were traditionally held by men, and therefore showing that they deserve a voice in their government, while other people thought the war hurt the movement in that citizens of the United States were a lot more sensitive of any critiques on the American government at the time, since we were going to war. Eventually, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, leading to the vote for women. So we're going to start talking about some important women's figures in the movement, the first of which is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton was born into an upper-class family. Her father was a lawyer. She graduated from Emma Willard Troy's Female Seminary in 1832. And during the Civil War, she concentrated her efforts in abolishing slavery. She was always a very big social reformist. She was one of the main leaders at the Seneca Falls Conventions in 1848, and she was the author of the Declaration of Sentiments, which was the first real piece of literature describing what the women's movement wanted. Along with Susan B. Anthony, she formed the National Women's Suffragist Association, NAWSA, in 1869, and she held the position of president of NAWSA for over 20 years. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was very strongly against the 15th Amendment, feeling that former slaves should not get the right to vote before the women of the country. The next woman who was very important in the movement was Susan B. Anthony. She was born to a Quaker family. She spent most of her life with her family working on social causes, part of the abolitionist movement and the temperance movement. She was another big leader at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And she was the other co-founder, along with Stanton, of the National Women's Suffragist Association. Susan B. Anthony was also very against the 15th Amendment, stating, "I would sooner cut off my right hand than ask the ballot for a black man and not for a woman." The next woman to talk about in the movement is Lucy Stone. She was born to an upper-class family that were abolitionists. At 16, she defied her parents to pursue a higher education. She attended Mount Holyoke Seminary for just one term, and then 4 years later enrolled at Oberlin College in Ohio. She paid for her own schooling since her parents were against her getting undergraduate schooling. And she graduated in 1847 with honors, becoming the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a bachelor's degree. She worked with Stanton and Anthony in Nassau, but had a falling out with them due to their lack of support in the 15th Amendment. Lucy Stone was very pro-15th Amendment, and she believed that the passage would eventually lead then to the women's right to vote. And she felt that everyone should be supportive of the 15th Amendment. Fast forwarding a little bit into history, the next major figure in the women's movement is Alice Paul, who was really the second wave of the suffragist movement. She was born to a Quaker family and attended Swarthmore College. She went to England when she was a young adult and participated in the militant suffragist movement there, which gave her a lot of ideas on how to bring the suffragist movement to the United States. When she came back to the United States, she earned her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1912, and she was the co-founder of the National Women's Party with Lucy Burns in 1913. Again, that party was founded due to the different ideals between Paul and the younger generation of college-educated women, and Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and the older generations of the suffragists. The National Women's Party used dramatic tactics in protests, including picketing of the White House, and many of them were arrested and jailed, and Alice Paul actually staged hunger strikes within those jails. So major problems with the women's suffragist movement in the United States. The movement was predominantly a white upper-class movement. So non-white women, especially African American, had minimal say in the movement and weren't really able to voice their own opinions and wants for the movement, because a lot of the suffragists felt like they had enough just trying to get the right to vote and didn't want to tax on any other issues, including race issues or class issues. Speaking of class issues, another issue was that lower class women really had no say in the movement either. It was primarily an upper class movement. Also, immigrant women really didn't have a say. The movement was also very fractured, one of the biggest being the pro and anti-15th Amendment movement, causing the party itself to fracture. Another disagreement was the use of extreme protest measures, whether or not picketing was acceptable, whether or not strikes and violence were acceptable. And then another fracture in the movement was the allowance of intersectionality, again referring up into different races and classes in the movement. To conclude, the women's suffragist movement was prompted by women finding work outside of the home and then needing rights and a voice in their government within their work. The movement took place in waves from 1840 to 1920. The movement was a fragmented movement. And the movement did eventually lead to the 19th Amendment, but had a lot of cons associated with it. So an exit question for you, class, is which approaches by suffragists do you feel were the most productive in the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment? Please write that down and hand it in at the beginning of class. Thank you for listening.